All right, well, good evening and welcome to this International Center for Moral Injury webinar titled Sharing Lament and Reinvesting in Hope When Loved Ones Die by Suicide. I'm delighted to welcome my dear colleague, Carrie Doehring, for this presentation and discussion this evening. My name is Brian Powers. I'm the inaugural Bernard William Vann Fellow in Christianity and the Military here at Durham University, as well as the Executive Director of the International Center for Moral Injury. And I'm glad that each of you has joined us tonight. As you likely know, the ICMI is committed to producing and receiving new scholarship on moral injury, facilitating new research by building networks of academic scholars, military officers, clergy, chaplains, and others with knowledge of and experience with moral injury. The ICMI seeks to create and develop resources for pastoral counselors, caregivers, churches, and faith organizations caring for morally injured individuals. Each of these things serves the center's ultimate goal of increasing an understanding of the causes and impacts of moral injury and facilitating increased care for those experiencing it. I do want to say just a couple of quick notes about our webinar this evening. First, we'll be diverging just a bit from our normal structure. We've divided tonight's event into two main sections. So Carrie will introduce our first section, discussing the moral injury of caring for a loved one with complex psychological struggles and despair, then share some of her own experience through a recorded conversation that will model a particularly helpful form of deep listening. Following that, we'll engage in a few minutes of question and answer before Carrie will introduce our second section on coping with the moral stress of caregiving in family situations. And to conclude our webinar, I'll engage in a conversation with Carrie on spiritual practices that may be salutary in this environment. I also just want to note that our webinar this evening will engage with the reality of suicide and the profound, sensitive, and difficult human emotions that it evokes in a very personal way. Certainly, we hope that through it, you might find resources to care for those who have suffered such loss, and indeed spiritual practices that will help in the difficult process of grieving and reinvesting in hope. If you have experienced the death of a friend, loved one, or family member to suicide, however, we also recognize that the webinar this evening may bring difficult emotions to the fore in ways that can be overwhelming. So at the outset, please know that there are networks of support available to you if you have lost a loved one to suicide, and particularly if tonight's webinar brings up overwhelming feelings in that regard. So to that end, Jane will post in just a moment the organization in the United Kingdom that does this, Survivors Bereavement by Suicide, and their website. In the United States, if you're joining us from there, there's also a particularly good military resource there that Jane will post in just a moment, the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. And so those are just two resources I want to highlight at the beginning of our webinar, and I will do so again at the end in case this is just so that you know they're there through the course of our conversation. So, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Carrie Doehring, this evening. Carrie is the Clifford Baldridge Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. She is a licensed psychologist in Massachusetts and Colorado and is ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA. Her scholarship focuses on interreligious, socially just, and research-literate spiritual care of trauma, moral stress, and spiritual struggles. She's the author of over 50 chapters and articles, including her authored chapter on practicing socially just, interreligious, and evidence-based spiritual care, and chaplaincy and spiritual care in the 21st century, an introduction. Her book, The Practice of Spiritual Care, A Postmodern Approach, Revised and Expanded, is used as a textbook in pastoral care and clinical pastoral education throughout the United States and Canada. She's co-editor of Military Moral Injury and Spiritual Care, a resource for religious leaders and professional caregivers, which is a reference I've pointed to several times in previous webinars. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to you, Carrie. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be with you. I've come to appreciate how much conversations about moral injury need to be grounded in lived experience. And especially the more I've worked with military chaplains and veterans who either explicitly or implicitly ground their writing and research in their own experiences, I've realized that my contribution to this topic is most vividly illustrated through my own experience, which I'll be referencing throughout this webinar. So I wanted to start by briefly just highlighting the salient points of my experience and inviting you to hold and honor your own experiences and draw upon whatever is most helpful and relevant for you in this conversation. So I'll be referencing my care for the second of my two sons, Alex, who struggled the last 10 years of his life with profound psychological depression that couldn't be alleviated through medication or therapy. And many times he struggled with whether his life was worth continuing. And his stepdad and I provided a lot of care for him during that time. The last 6 months of his life were really shaped by intractable depression. And he ended up ending his life about almost 5 years ago. And so what I want to share with you is what I have learned about the moral stress and injury of caring for a loved one with these kind of struggles who then chooses to end their life. And the first hour of our time together will focus on that experience of losing a loved one through suicide. And then the second half will shift into what is it like to have the very common and heartrending experience that many people have of caring for loved ones, especially children and teens, young adults, and the elderly, and how our spiritual practices can help us. So 3 things I want to highlight about Alex's struggles, which really shape my experience, but maybe different from any experiences you may have had, is that we knew that he had these struggles and he had a lot of very good care. And so I had an inside perspective on that care. He gave me permission to have that. So I was able to track kind of the ups and downs of his struggles, which really, even as hard as it is to understand that incomprehensible choice that a loved one makes to end their life, I had a lot of background for understanding that. And also, I had a very caring community, a very caring church community that helped me with my religious struggles. And working in the area of spiritual care and chaplaincy, I have colleagues like Brian, a lot of colleagues where I teach my students who are not afraid to talk about these issues. And that's what we're trying to promote here, a space for sharing and caring for each other, because it's the isolation with struggles that is so harmful. So that's what we're trying to create here today, having you honor and share your lived experiences and how to really listen to the mystery of those experiences with each other, and to encourage you to find places to do that. So I always begin my workshops and classes by using a pretty simple breathing practice that helps us remember that our grief and our struggles, and indeed our experiences of moral injury, is always grounded in our bodies. And so we need to listen to our bodies and recognize the way, as Bessel van der Kolk says, our bodies keep the score. And I use a very simple breathing practice, which I'm going to describe, then we're going to do together. Then we'll take a few minutes to remember in a moment of quiet. I'll be remembering Alex, those I've cared for. And I want you to, in whatever ways is helpful for you, to name and honor your own experiences. So the breathing practice I'll take you through is pretty simple, deep, slow breathing. I'll invite you to adjust your posture, close your eyes if you wish. We'll inhale to the count of 4, pause for a few seconds, exhale slowly, and then rest. And after several rounds, I found it very helpful to invite people to use the pressure of touch if they wish. I find it helps to spark a sense of self-compassion and particularly helps me be aware of my body. And for some people, these practices actually are not helpful because they remind them of trying to use practices like this when they have anxiety or stress, or it reminds them of how they've used these practices to prepare for a really difficult, focused event. So use the practice in whatever way is helpful. So if you wish, adjust your posture so you feel grounded and you feel supported by your chair. And if you wish, close your eyes. And if you want to breathe together with me, let's inhale. And pause. And exhale slowly. And rest. And if you wish to do another deep breath together, let's inhale together. Pause. Exhale slowly. And the last 2 rounds, I invite you to inhale at your own pace. And if you wish, add the warmth and pressure of touch. And now let's take a moment. I'll actually give us 1 whole minute. If you wish to meditate on these candles, focus on an object around you that might represent an experience you remember so that we can dedicate our time together to our own experiences of despair, our own experiences of caring for those who experience despair, and experiences of mourning lives that end in suicide. And I thank you for naming those people and making them part of the web of care that we're dedicating our time to. I invite you throughout our time together, when you experience in your body a moment of grief or anxiety, to see if you can be aware of that and honor your body in some way, perhaps through a slow, deep breath or through the warmth and pressure of touch. And I find that these body and breath-based self-care practices that spark self-compassion in us and connect us to the compassion of others have the potential to be explicitly or implicitly spiritual. And often they connect us to the beauty we may experience through nature, through art. And if we're part of religious and faith communities that represent the transcendent through different symbols and rituals and practices, it helps us connect that breath or body practice with how we experience goodness through others, creation, and God. So I'm going to move for a few moments into some of the research behind what we're exploring today. Experiences of despair, caring for those who experience despair, and of course, mourning the death of someone who ends their life brings on acute stress, which basically turns our world and our lives upside down. And when that acute stress includes things that threaten our well-being, threaten the well-being of those we love, then this can have traumatic elements and elements of moral stress and injury. And I'm defining that in a very basic way. Moral stress, often it's a conflict in values. It can be feel as though we're transgressing or we're not living out our most core values of how we protect and care for others, especially those who are struggling to hold on to life. And it's, as we'll talk about, and as you can easily imagine, caring for those with pretty profound psychological struggles always involves fear of causing harm. Even with, we know through research that the best way to care for someone struggling with despair is to ask explicitly about whether they have thoughts of ending their lives. And this often brings up moral stress for people who wonder whether that question could provoke others to think about something they have not thought about. Research demonstrates that's not the case, that people feel more reassured when we can ask these questions. And often there's a sense of betrayal, especially with psychological systems that aren't able to adequately care for others because of the limits of mental health care, especially nowadays, the limits of spiritual care, the limits of research. So these issues inevitably bring up moral stress and moral injury, and I'll highlight the difference between those in a moment. So what our breath-based practices help us do is be aware of how we grieve and experience moral stress, first and foremost in our bodies and our stress responses, and how that gives rise to stress-based emotions like fear, shame, anxiety, that have the potential to isolate us and make it hard for us to reach out to others and also draw upon all the resources and relationships we have. When we're able to use a breath practice or a body practice, then we are able to hold those stress-based emotions with compassion. And then the experience of self-compassion, sadness, awe, gratitude shifts us into a different way of being with what's going on in our bodies, and especially moral stress. Then we're able to start to differentiate between the values and beliefs generated by stress, like it's all up to us. We're responsible, we're guilty if we're not able to care for and protect others. And we can realize that's a stress-based set of beliefs and values about caring that is life-limiting. And we can hold that with compassion and hold that self that's experiencing that. And then we're able to shift our behaviors and how we cope with stress. And we're able to realize the more we can use those breath and body practices that connect us with goodness, the more we'll able to integrate these struggles. And this is the research that's summarized in a recent publication by Kenneth Pargament and Julie Exline. And I use the first 3 chapters of this book in a lot of the courses I teach. It's a wonderful summary of this research. And the research tells us that there are many kinds of experiences that generate spiritual struggles. Major life events, like the kind we're talking about, moral transgressions, feeling like we're not able to fulfill what we may see as our sacred roles as parents, as sons and daughters, as loved ones, as friends. Events that violate or harm sacred values. For example, when I thought about a helpful way I thought about Alex's struggles with depression was that it really compromised the sanctity of who he was and what his life was. And erased, especially when I used a diagnosis to understand him, it erased the mystery of who he was and really truncated his story and how I experience him. And often there are many layers of social and personal injustice, particularly around getting care, the kind of care we get, and unanswered prayers. Prayer is a very relevant and meaningful way people try to cope, especially when they feel helpless in the face of helping someone else. And to feel as though your prayers are not answered can give rise to spiritual struggles. And some of these struggles are explicit, struggles with God. And I've come to appreciate how complex it is to really recognize struggles. I so often, when I struggle with moral stress, particularly around my sense of being responsible for others, there's an implicit self-judgment that, because of my upbringing, often will trigger a condemning God from childhood that I may not even be aware of, but I'm very sensitive to. So struggles with God are sometimes hard to name if those struggles have been part of your childhood, but you still carry them in your body. Explicit struggles may include struggles with your religious community, fear that others are judging you, the reality that they may be judging you, questions about your religious values, your vocation, your identity, and questions especially about whether your practices are helpful, especially if you've experienced prayer as unanswered, or, as was my experience for a long time, going to church and being in that quiet space where I was simply receiving and taking in the religious meaning and language and community was often a very hard place to be, because it would often give rise to struggles. Implicit spiritual struggles may be part of feelings of worry, shame, guilt, especially a sense of not belonging to our spiritual community, a sense of self-condemnation. So what's helpful about really using the lens of spiritual struggles to understand moral stress is that it helps us understand those struggles within us. The most common way of describing moral stress is conflicts in values. How do I protect those I care for? Especially when we're trying to do that while balancing many other demands and responsibilities in our lives. Doubts, fears about God's condemnation. These are all internal struggles. Then there are the systematic spiritual struggles we're very aware of now with the limitations of healthcare, interpersonal struggles with faith communities. Others may struggle to know how to care for us. I mentioned that I've been very fortunate to work and live in communities of people who are not afraid to talk about these issues, but that's not the case for many people. Of course, there are still so many struggles with those who use their beliefs and values to judge us. And this does come up with suicide, people feeling like if they had enough faith, then they would not experience this despair, or if they had enough faith as loved ones, they would be better able to care for those who were struggling. And of course, we're in the territory now of theology, meanings about the finitude and limits of our knowledge. especially when it comes to suffering and what may be experienced and may feel like evil, and finitude and resources. This was certainly the experience I had with Alex, the kind of intractable depression he had that could not be treated. So these are sources of spiritual struggles that help us understand how the resources and meaning making in our spiritual and religious communities then interface with a lot of the research done about how and when spiritual struggles are harmful and what it means to really work with those struggles, which is what we're trying to share in this workshop. So, of course, stress, the kind of stress we're talking about, grieving someone who ends their life by suicide, caring for someone with these struggles, inevitably overwhelms our capacity to cope and gives rise to acute stress, that 2 or 3 or 6 week experience of our world being turned upside down. And spiritual struggles, research shows, are always part of acute stress because our whole way of understanding the world and coping is thrown upside down. So then the question is, what do we do with those transitory struggles? So if our struggles increase and become chronic, this is what the research shows, then we're more likely to develop post-traumatic stress, which is what happens over the long term when we're isolated with those trauma stress responses, and moral injury, which is the sense of life threat combined with questions about who caused harm? Did we cause harm? Were we betrayed by systems? And there's a lot of emerging research in research language that spiritual struggles will mediate the relationship between stress, transitory struggles, and whether those struggles become chronic. So that also means if we can find ways to recognize and name and address those struggles, then we may be able to integrate them instead of becoming isolated. And I want to reference here Larry Kent Graham's work on lament, because what we're really talking about here is a process of lament. That when we can share our anguish, which is what we're doing in a seminar like this, particularly as we honor and dedicate those we are remembering and our own struggles, if we can share our anguish, particularly through practices that honor the way grief is carried in our bodies, then we're more able to reach out to trusted others with these struggles and find community support. Then we're in a long-term process of integrating struggles. And it is long-term. I'm in my 5th year, and I can look back and see how much that jagged rupture of grief, which is so intense in the first year, the second year starts to become more part of a sharing of sadness that isn't so disruptive, that becomes spiritually integrated. And that's what we're hoping for, but it is a very long-term process. I wrote an article, which I'll as shared in the references in the PowerPoint slide, about grieving Alex's death. And it made me realize how much I needed, first and foremost, spiritual practices that helped me experience compassion and goodness in my body, in my relationships, in my sense of who the transcendent is to me. And it was when I was able to experience that compassion and honor the way my body was grieving, that then my search for meanings became much more flexible. And I was able to integrate those into the teaching I do, just my day-to-day life. And then these meanings became much more complex. And I share this photo here of aspen trees, which are common where I live in Denver, because they're the largest living organism in the world. They're all one root system. And I have found this image helps me understand the brevity of life. Like an aspen tree may only live 25 years and then it dies and a new tree sprouts. So it helps me realize a sense of wholeness to Alex's life, a sense of wholeness to my life. And I grieve, as you'll hear in my conversation with my colleague Ken Pargament, through listening to sacred music. And many of the settings I listen to, I particularly love the settings in the Anglican and Episcopal tradition of evensong, of two biblical texts, what's called the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis, from gospel texts that have been set to music for many centuries and performed and listened to over many centuries. And I find listening to this kind of music really gives me a sense of transcendence in terms of my own life, and really connects me to the goodness of how, for me in my own tradition, how complex these religious meanings are for sustaining me. So what we want to find are body-based practices that help us experience goodness within us. That's the interreligious term I use. And then the goodness of our interdependency with others, and the goodness, as we know, of how dependent we are on creation. And then the goodness of interdependency, if we have a sense of transcendence that includes those dimensions. And why don't I introduce the video conversation I did with Ken? So in my teaching, I've been focusing a lot on how we're able to practice what I call deep listening with those who share this kind of anguish and these struggles. And deep listening is simply our capacity to follow others, to invite others into a conversation about this kind of lament, and then to simply follow them in the meaning making they do, and particularly focus on what helps them experience goodness, what helps. And in a webinar I did with psychologist of religion Ken Pargament, I asked if he would do a deep listening conversation with me about what helps me when I experience grief for Alex. And we recorded this conversation a year ago or so. And in my PowerPoint slides, I'll post the link to the whole webinar where Ken goes through slides, talks about spiritual struggles. Then we have this deep listening. And then we invited those in the webinar to pair up and do some deep listening conversations with each other. I think that gives us enough background. It is a very poignant conversation, so I invite you to use your breath practices as needed as you listen.
Okay, and I'm going to be the listener, and Carrie's going to share something of her experience with struggle with me. So let me start first by thanking you, Carrie, for your willingness to talk with me about your own struggles and your experience of them. That takes a lot of courage, I think. So I'm very appreciative of that, Carrie. But maybe we could talk a bit then about what are you struggling with in your own spirituality?
Yeah, a lot of my struggles are grounded in losing the younger of my two sons, Alex, to suicide about 4 years ago. And I've had a very supportive community, and I teach a lot about struggles. I guess of many people, I feel like I'm surrounded by many people who can share that kind of struggle with me. But given that it's a very traumatic death, because Alex struggled with very profound depression for about 10 years before he ended his life when he was 27. So there were many times when we thought we would lose him. And I find nowadays the moment of struggle comes when I'm out and about and I see a young man walking down the street, and there's something about the body language that makes me think for a moment that it's Alex. And it's almost like one of those uncanny experiences that Freud talked about, where it seems like suddenly the past is in the present. And then in that moment, I experienced both those moments of hope I had when kind of the mystery of who Alex was looked like it was going to kind of connect him to goodness and hold him in the world. But then almost like a whole tearing of the net of goodness that would then cause a young man like Alex to end his life. And so these moments are very visceral, like it's just this whole upswelling of, I would say, anguish and lament. And the spiritual struggle, somewhat it's like, why would God not love Alex the way I did and hold him in life with all the hope I had that he would get better, that something would help? And it's also this fear that what else is going to happen? Like, could someone else I love die that way? Like just that all the goodness of life that holds us in life and keeps us alive and connected to goodness suddenly just seems to tear, And then there's this sense of unraveling, like, what else of those I love could I lose?
It sounds, Carrie, I hear you saying that this has been an anguishing experience on a lot of levels for you.
Mm-hmm.
Physically anguishing and a rending experience that has torn apart your life, your hope that Alex would somehow find a way to work his periods of depression through and stay with us.
Yeah.
Rather than leave us. And another piece of that anguish I'm hearing is also an anguish about God's place in this. Why would God allow this? Why wasn't God there to help protect and nurture and keep Alex in the world, which leads also to the feeling of uncertainty and instability in your life about why wouldn't this happen again? Can you trust the world? Can you trust other people? Can you trust God? And that I keep coming back to that word anguish because it somehow seems to be, as you describe it, I see that can you say a little bit more about that feeling of anguish and maybe that you've been experiencing?
Yeah, it's more like just so physiological, like it's almost like the world as I know it is just torn. I was thinking for some reason today of the image in the Passion story when Jesus dies, the curtain of the temple is rent, that it's just this hole opens up and there's no gravity anymore.
So without any gravity, what is that experience like, not having the gravity that maybe we count on in some ways to keep us upright? What's that like for you, Carrie?
A lot of fear that even this young man that I'm looking at, could his life just unravel in the same way? What is holding him in love? Yeah.
So without gravity, what's to keep people together? What's to hold people together?
Yeah.
And that's fearful for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I still appreciate you sharing these feelings, Carrie. They're so very painful. As you talk about them, I can see it and feel it. I wonder if we could shift gears a little, because I wonder in dealing with this experience of struggle and anguish, what if anything have you found helpful?
I try to, I think the hardest part is, as you said, like that instinct to suppress the pain, because that comes from my family of origin, where that kind of pain would be overwhelming. And so we couldn't share that kind of pain as children. So I try to imagine those gathered with me in that moment, that I'm not standing alone, sort of in the sort of memorial moment of remembering Alex. So I imagine people like you, Ken, standing with me. You know, I was thinking today of how when you visited in Boston, I would drive Alex to school, and we would be heading to BU, and you'd have a conversation with Alex about his lunch and whatever. So I try to imagine people who knew and loved Alex standing with me. I have a very good therapist who understands how complex Alex's struggles were, that there were no easy answers. So I imagine her standing with me. And then when students and I together, they reflect on these kind of traumatic losses, I imagine that we're standing with each other, kind of just sharing the anguish and bearing witness. And that, to me, knits the web of life back together.
That language, I'm really struck by it, of how you describe standing together. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. What does that mean to you or feel to you, having people who stand with you?
It's extraordinary. I mean, I think one of the fears about talking about this stuff is that it will overwhelm other people. But I found that people in my life are able to stand with me. You know, sometimes when I approach an anniversary, like the anniversary of Alex's death or his birthday, I can experience a particularly sharp feelings of grief. And the last time this happened, I reached out to my pastor and a couple of very dear friends, Bo Young and Sheila Devaney. So we gathered at church for one of the services, one of the evening services, and then we all gathered and prayed together. And then we spent some time afterwards sharing memories of those we loved. So to have people who I can reach out to and who can gather with me, that's just an extraordinary resource. And to me, that is God.
Yeah, I also hear it that in that kind of the flip side of that for you, maybe you experienced more growing up, that to not have that meant that somehow you would overwhelm people.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than have people stand with you, they would be overwhelmed.
Yes.
And that was a fear, or maybe is a fear for you.
Yeah, it's a kind of goes with the body sensation of intense grief. Even I know consciously that that's not my experience now. Like my brother and my sisters we're able to stand together now in ways we couldn't experience as children. But it's almost like the immediate physiology of grief is that it's going to be too much.
But your experience has been and now is something very different.
Yes.
That you have people who do stand with you, and I'm struck by that, what you described of kind of knitting people together.
Mm-hmm.
In a kind of a web of life, I think you were saying.
Yes.
That way you're sounds like interwoven, and you're all standing together.
Mhm.
That's a to hear it. It sounds like a very powerful experience for you.
Mm. It is.
Other ways that you found resources or help, Carrie, with the struggle of Alex's loss and the struggles with the wish and pain of having being so shaken from your whole world has been shaken.
I've always listened to sacred choral music as just the deepest kind of spiritual experience for me. So during the course of the day, there's now a whole series of webcasts of religious music services, actually religious services that I listen to, and music that has just been part of my life, especially since studying music as an undergraduate. It feels like that music not only has carried me through, but has carried many people through, especially over centuries. So some of these pieces of choral music have been performed for hundreds of years. And I imagine others who find solace and comfort in the same way.
How does it carry you through or touch you? I have this image of you being held.
Well, the skeptic in me used to kind of, I guess, argue with some of the symbolism of the church, like the cross. But I find that maybe it's a matter of getting older and kind of not feeling I have to take up those kind of battles anymore, that I just let the imagery wash over me. Like a couple of Sundays ago, we did the hymn, Take Up Thy Cross, at the end of the church service. And there was just something about everybody singing it together that was just so powerful.
Thank you for sharing that. And we need to stop now, but I want you to know how, again, deeply appreciative I am of you sharing your experience of struggle and what's been helpful to you in this. Again, you're very, very generous and courageous in talking about this with me and with our group. So thanks so much, Carrie.
Oh, you're welcome. It's not hard to trust the process, Ken, when I know you're the listener.
That was an example of a deep listening conversation. Of course, Ken Pargament brings all of his gifts as a researcher and a therapist to doing deep listening. But you could hear the ways he was echoing back my words and my images and shifting partway through to asking me what helped, which was really helpful. And this would be an example of the kind of conversation one might have with someone you trust. It also describes to some extent that whole process of recognizing struggles in one's body, finding ways to cope that are helpful rather than isolating. Brian, do you want to move into questions and answers? Maybe people want to also share responses.
Sure. No, thank you so much, Carrie. I really appreciate that and all you've shared here. So maybe before we move entirely from that, to take us maybe actually as a good transition in the sense of chaplaincy again, that notion that particularly as those perhaps who are tasked with that deep listening, if that's the highest calling, to essentially listen, to hear, to minister, to provide that pastoral care. It seems in so many situations we're finding that itself can contribute very much to a sense of unmooring in the same way we've talked, that simply the duty and the care and the witness to that over time can really create its own sense of moral injury or moral stress, and to use those same terms that you've so evocatively used, of rending, of disconnection, of I'm not living into the person that I'm supposed to be. Um, I don't know, there's just something I think deeply powerful about that duty to care. And I don't know if you perhaps want to say something about that as we move into the next part when we're talking about caring, that same kind of capacity to care for moral stresses.
Yes. It's been really helpful for me to understand the way I experience in my body, that sense that it's all up to me.
Mm.
And often when I'm in a conversation with someone, I can realize, oh, I'm now living out a certain body theology of how I'm supposed to pastor, which is it's all up to me. But then if I just take a deep, slow breath and recognize the self that's experiencing that, and hold that self with compassion, almost like I'm putting my arm around the self that's anxious in that way.
Mm.
And then also knowing the networks we have that are available to us. You could sense in my conversation with Ken, I know Ken really well. I knew that Ken wouldn't be overwhelmed by what I was talking about. So I think just our calm demeanor, our body language can convey that sense that I can listen, that I'm listening to you making meaning of this. It's not up to me to make meaning of this. And I think what some people may not realize in our practice of spiritual care about how much these conversations become part of who people are. Like that conversation I had with Ken was a real milestone when I look back at last year. And it continues to linger and have life and unfold mystery for me. So even though it was a single conversation, it's now part of that knitting of the web. And I think sometimes we forget that when we're providing care.
No, that's a really helpful way to look at it as well. Let me ask us, Carrie, just to move now into our formally, I guess, into the second half of this, as we say, though we will wrap in about 25 minutes at our normal time. Might you say something then about, I guess, the moral stress of caring for family directly, and we'll have a conversation shortly then about some continuing what I feel is a very connected conversation about practices then that can help out with that.
Yeah. You could see it came up in my conversation with Ken, where grief triggers that fear of, can I care for someone else with these struggles? And I often experience that fear, like just listening to how many people are struggling with providing care for children and teens struggling, people who are isolated. There's often this sense of feeling overwhelmed. And I think it's really important to just recognize when that's happening and hold that in compassion, and then visualize the web of care that's available to us, we can access and experience in many different ways. I have often found when I've talked to people caring for loved ones with these struggles to see how they can expand their network of care, particularly if they have access to community groups, peer groups, and behavioral health specialists. Like I said in my conversation with Ken, that it's really helpful for me to find a therapist who understood the extent of Alex's struggles and who could keep reminding me of that. That helped me hold on to the tragic dimensions, the finitude of what I could do and what others could do to help. So I think just really trying to expand our resources is really important.
Is there a sense too, and I know clearly there's moments when we have relatives that are struggling with in profound ways like this that are incredibly morally stressful. Um, but it strikes me too that there's also a good bit of moral stress and that same sense of responsibility, as I think you noted, in less or just more mundane,
Yeah.
almost situations of care for both children or perhaps on the other side of it, aging family members as well.
Mhm.
Um, is there Are there particular practices you find valuable in just the normal kind of ups and downs that comparatively are relatively minor? But I think I know as a parent myself, I feel this deeply,
Yeah.
that all these moments are always ones of deep responsibility that I have a duty to attend to. And if I don't, and if I fail at doing the simple aspects of it, I'm morally failing. So are there simple ways that we can and practices that we can do that help us kind of connect with those, or that you found really valuable in some of those ways?
I think body practices, breath practices, connecting with nature, having regular ways to experience a sense of goodness that transcends us is really helpful. And then having allies. I mentioned in my conversation with Ken that my brother and my sisters are allies. And I often really feel for people I know who function as only children in families, say they're the only one that kind of is sensing the struggle, because others are overwhelmed by that. That makes it really hard. So finding allies where we can have regular conversations about these sources of stress.
Mm. Yeah, I find that I hear that idea of just regular sources of stress, even in some way, just naming that is
Yeah.
immensely valuable. And I think that seems to fall in a lot of the same realm as there's so much power in just naming some of these categories and being able to talk about them as such, view things as mystery rather than simple linear cause and effect relationships, seeing things as community rather than individuals. Um, there's an interesting question actually from Jan Schultes that's just come in that I thought this might bring us to in an interesting way as well. So she asks, uh, she says, you notice that you, Carrie, quite easily employ the term spiritual care, which she says she greatly appreciates for its welcoming tone and accessibility. A simple musing: has a patient, client, student ever responded by asking what spiritual care is meant to care for? Has anyone ever responded by asking what you hold a spirit to be and what you believe spiritual care can accomplish? If so, how did you answer, or what would you answer? And I think this is a really great question because it does get at this term. You've hinted at it in some of the earlier presentation, I think, but what is spirituality in that sense to you?
In my own teaching, because I teach in a very religiously diverse context at Isla School of Theology, and I teach with many folks who have been harmed by childhood religion. I've used the term goodness. How do you experience goodness, particularly in your body? Because I do think finding ways to experience goodness in our bodies and then align those with our values and beliefs is part of integration. So that's why I like using the term goodness and linking it to body. And there are many traditions that have been harmed when that word spiritual has been imposed upon them, particularly Native American or First Nations traditions, because spiritual inevitably imposes a Christian orientation or a theistic orientation. And then names certain things within their world that is a form of desecration. So I like acknowledging the harm that is done by the word spiritual, but then also claiming the research that has been done on ways in which aspects of spirituality and religion can be helpful and harmful, and having people try to reclaim that in their lives in some way or another.
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful um, way of navigating some of the difficult boundaries I think we all face from time to time, whether in different settings of care or chaplaincy, or simply navigating as we're talking about things like moral injury. There's so many ways, and I think, one of the things that you bring up there, I think is so critical in how we practice care, and to me sometimes becomes a very paralyzing thing as someone who attempts to give care, and that is the idea that I'm going to do harm
Yeah.
inadvertently, in kind of doing my best. And certainly, I think a lot of the tools and a lot of the resources you've given in different ways you've talked about that are really helpful in ensuring that we don't. But might you say something just about that fear of doing harm? Because clearly you've magnificently overcome it in so many ways. Um,
Yes.
but in a way that's so paralyzing. And I think particularly, this is a question that could expand into a lot of different ways, but particularly in this setting, is that something you worry about or confronted by much?
Well, what I have learned through teaching spiritual care is just the power of deep listening that models interreligious respect. So my students will video Zoom conversations where they ask their learning partner a simple question like how to experience goodness, especially when you struggle, similar to what Ken did. And then they just listen. And they record that, and then we look at it together in terms of what was a jarring moment when I felt like I wanted to share my story, or when I felt overwhelmed by a sense of responsibility, and then naming what helped in that moment. Like a lot of my students will use an in the moment practice, like a slow, deep breath, or some of them even, like one student would just lightly touch her hand there out of sight to remind herself she was part of a web of caring. And so just looking at the nitty gritty of a conversation, how and whether we trust the process, because that's basically what we're talking about. And how when we're feeling overwhelmed or our emotions go out of whack, if we can maintain a calm body language, we can hold ourselves while we continue to listen. And it is amazing, like I've listened to, well, over 100 of these conversations, how wise people are about what helps. And all we need to do is listen.
Yeah, there's, you know, I think so much of this that you've rightly focused on listening, and that I hear you focusing on that, is certainly, perhaps that's the answer to this question of doing harm, is maybe it's less doing
Yes.
and then thinking of less of what we're doing and more of being in that place of witness and
Yeah.
attending to um, things particularly. Um, and something struck me in that same way that you mentioned in the video with Ken about your own family of
Mm,
origin, how it was difficult to do that for the same fear that you'd be burdening
yeah.
almost others with that. Would you be willing to share a little bit more perhaps about overcoming that? Because I think that's
Yeah.
such a powerful thing, because it's such a key part of social trust and learning how to knit that web back together, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, right now, my family, we're all allies with my sister who's caring for my aging mother. She's 96. And we've had a practice in our family of kind of planning difficult conversations around what makes her life good and how she thinks about death. And so we'll plan these ahead of time, and then we'll designate the conversation we're going to talk about it. And then I will be tasked with asking the opening question. And my mom will always say, I know you've talked about this. And so we have a whole kind of ritual for doing this, which has helped us have difficult conversations. But I think just being intentional, like I have friends I meet with on a regular basis, and I'm tracking what their struggles are. and I'll create an agenda in my mind. I want to make sure I ask about this. It's just this matter of tracking and then trusting, not planning the whole conversation in advance, kind of like this seminar. We had an outline, but we didn't script it all. We just trust the process.
That's helpful. And I wonder, is there, in trusting that process, it strikes me too that one of the aspects we've talked about, for example, in the last webinar, rituals and religious rituals, and we've touched on that here in, much more bodily focused terms, wonderfully. And I wonder, a lot of what we know about moral injury, though, is also that sense of broken social trust.
Right.
And that it's really difficult to be able to invest again in those same things that we, a good bit of research shows can be really helpful. It requires some kind of buy-in, to that religious tradition that you talked about struggling with at several times. And I think that's a powerful thing that many of us can relate to, that idea of, being able to have enough trust and buy-in to this framework of meaning to find meaning in it itself. Do you see some of these practices, I suppose, in a very bodily way as steps in restoring perhaps that sense of social trust and reinvesting in a system of belief?
Yeah. I think we do the best we can to prepare for an opportunity or a possible conversation. Knowing that we can't script it all in advance. But even just realizing in our gut when we're trusting the process, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but that's because we're all fallible and sometimes it comes together. And I have a feeling that many of our listeners, if they were to think back over formative conversations they've had that have really made a difference, they could realize, oh yeah, I know how to trust the process. I know what this kind of integration process feels like.
Is there, I love that idea too of integration is a really good word for it. I think naming that as knitting things together. As you talk to it just strikes me as perhaps prompting a slightly different aspect of the same family care conversation and the moral stresses in that sense. I find myself easily relating in my own bias to that towards children in this, just because of my own life at the moment. But I know I'm also approaching one in which my parents will be aging and moving into different stages. Are there particular moral stresses that come with that particular aspect of things that you found are there, particular ways, I know probably similar ones we've talked about, but are there particular things you found beneficial in that particular setting?
I found it so helpful to have conversations with others about what makes my life good. I think particularly with fears around what aging will involve for many of us, particularly around dementia, I think. So to have places to name those fears, to construct our own spiritual orientations to what makes aging good, and then to open up those conversations, particularly with family members. I think many family members have a lot of wisdom they could draw upon about what made being together when someone was dying good, what made it less helpful, and then trying to then take the wisdom from those experiences and think about what they would want for themselves or what they would want for someone they're caring for.
Yeah, that's so rich. I think that idea of framing it in terms of fears and naming those seems like it must be a huge part of that process, particularly in end of life care. In those situations with family members, just being able to express that in those ways. Well, we can see there's so many appreciative
Yes.
responses to in the chat that I want to acknowledge, Carrie, and just um, certainly to add my appreciation to that. I so appreciate you coming to this webinar, to also being so vulnerable
Mm.
to this and open and authentic. I think that's something wonderful, and that having known you for just a couple of years now, that I really cherish about the way you bring to this, and I think is so valuable. And I so appreciate you being able to model that with us this evening. So let me just say thank you so much for that and for your presence here with us tonight.
I've found it just a wonderful experience, and I've really appreciated what people have shared, particularly when you've named in the comments, those of you who've shared things you've struggled with, loved ones you've lost. That's been really meaningful. I've been tracking that and honoring that.
So let me say too, I think we've gotten to most questions, but if there's something that comes in at the end, Carrie, perhaps we can even get back to that person in a different way digitally here. But let me just say, is because we're approaching our time limit, and I want to respect our conversation, and certainly how I think wonderfully meaningful and rich this has been, and move to conclude our webinar for the evening. Certainly, again, so many thanks go to Carrie for offering her profound expertise through this. Also, to echo her concern, I want to thank each and every one of you for being with us tonight and participating. And here then, I would just wish you all a good night. Thank you.